No respectable woman survives a night in a duke's bedroom unless the duke chooses to be honorable. Clara Bennet stood in the center of the tower chamber with melting snow dripping from the hem of her gray wool dress. Her gloved hands clenched so tightly around her torn traveling bag that the leather creaked beneath her fingers. The room was too grand for safety and too silent for mercy. A fire burned low in the black marble hearth, throwing thin orange light across dark oak panels, a veiled portrait, and a bed large enough to look less like furniture than judgment. Beyond the narrow windows, the storm struck Hawthorne Hall with both fists, rattling the glass, screaming through the stone, burying the world outside beneath a white and merciless dark. Behind her, the door closed with a sound that seemed final. Clara turned sharply. Duke Alexander Hayes stood there, tall and still in his black coat, his pale face carved by candlelight, his dark hair damp from the storm. He had the expression of a man who had forgotten how to ask gently for anything. His gray eyes moved once from the fire to the bed, then back to her, and his voice came low, controlled, and cold enough to make the room feel smaller. One room, one bed. For a heartbeat, Clara could not breathe. All the warnings she had ever heard about powerful men returned at once, not as words, but as a tightening in her chest. She was alone, penniless, dismissed without reference, her name already stained by an accusation she had not earned, and now trapped in the private chamber of a duke whose house looked as though it had been mourning for years. Her chin lifted before her courage did. "Then I shall stand, your grace." Something moved across his face, not anger, not amusement, but a wound touched by mistake. He removed his gloves slowly and placed them on the writing desk. "You will do no such thing." Clara stepped back until her skirt brushed the carved foot of the bed. "I have already lost my position tonight. I will not lose my dignity as well." The words trembled only at the edges, and she hated that he might hear it. The Duke looked at her for a long moment. The fire snapped between them. Then, without coming closer, he crossed to the tall windows, pulled down one of the heavy velvet curtains, and with a small silver knife from his desk cut the curtain cord in a single clean motion. Clara flinched at the suddenness, but he did not look at her. He dragged the velvet across the room and fastened it between the bedposts and the wardrobe, making a dark partition that divided the chamber in two. Only then did he take a brass key from his pocket and set it on the table nearest her. Beside it, he placed a small bell. "You will sleep behind that screen. You will lock the door from your side if it comforts you. I will remain by the fire until morning." Clara stared at the key as if it were a thing she had never been given before. Choice. The Duke's jaw tightened. The east wing roof has fallen. The guest rooms are flooded. The servants' quarters are full of families pulled from the road before the bridge iced over. Outside, the snow is already 3 feet deep against the lower doors. "If you step beyond this house tonight, Miss Bennet, the storm will take you before dawn." He said it without softness, yet not without care. That was what unsettled her most. Clara's soaked sleeves clung to her wrists. A shiver passed through her before she could hide it. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Men like him noticed everything and revealed nothing. Alexander removed his coat and laid it over the back of a chair near the partition, far enough that she would have to choose whether to take it. "There are dry blankets in the chest. I will not turn around." "You expect me to trust you?" she asked. "No," he said. "I expect you to survive me." The answer struck the air between them with strange weight, as if he had not meant only tonight. Clara looked beyond him to the veiled portrait above the hearth. Beneath the black gauze, the faint shape of a woman's face waited in shadow. The clock on the mantel had stopped at 2:17, its hands frozen like a warning no one had dared to correct. Hawthorne Hall was not merely a house. It was a grave with candles. And this man, this feared and silent Duke of Hawthorne, seemed less its master than its prisoner. Another blast of wind shook the tower. The fire bowed low, then rose again. Clara took one careful step toward the key. Her fingers closed around the cold brass. For the first time that night, the Duke lowered his eyes, granting her the privacy of fear. She moved behind the velvet screen, holding the key as though it were a prayer. Outside, the storm erased every road. Inside, one room held a ruined woman, a broken Duke, and a bed neither of them dared approach without remembering the cost of being human. 3 hours before Clara Bennet stood behind the velvet screen with the Duke's key in her hand, She had been running through the storm with no destination except away. The Harrington carriage had left her at the edge of Mill Creek Road, as if she were a parcel delivered to the wrong door, and the coachman had not looked back when she stumbled into the snow with her torn valise and the half-burned letter of reference pressed against her heart. Behind her, Harrington House glowed on the hill with all its windows lit for supper, warm and golden and false. Only that morning, Clara had still been governess to little Maggie Harrington, a solemn child with copper curls and eyes too old for 8 years. By evening, Clara had been named a thief before the household staff, accused of stealing Lady Harrington's pearl necklace, and dismissed without wages, without shelter, without even the mercy of darkness to hide her shame. She had not wept when they searched her trunk. She had not pleaded when Lady Harrington held up the necklace, suddenly found beneath Clara's folded stockings. She had only looked at Maggie, who stood near the nursery door with both hands over her mouth, trembling as if she knew the truth but had been warned never to speak it. That was the image that followed Clara into the storm, not the necklace, not the accusation, not the sharp pleasure in Lady Harrington's voice, but Maggie's frightened eyes. Clara had discovered too much. In the schoolroom ledger, between pages of arithmetic and Latin verbs, she had found the copy of an old will that gave Maggie a small inheritance from her late mother, money meant for her education, protection, and future. The original had vanished. Lady Harrington had smiled when Clara asked about it. Mr. Harrington had looked away. By sunset, Clara was the criminal. By nightfall, the house had rid itself of the witness. The snow came down harder as she walked, each flake catching in her lashes, each gust of wind cutting through her worn cloak. The road disappeared beneath white drifts. Bare trees leaned over her like silent judges. Twice she slipped. Once she dropped her valise and watched the few things she owned scatter across the snow: a comb, a pair of mended gloves, a child's primer, and the little blue book of fairy tales Maggie had begged her to keep. Clara gathered them with stiff fingers, but the torn reference letter flew from her grasp and vanished into the dark like the last proof that she had ever been respectable. Still she walked. Respectable women did not pound on strange doors after midnight. Respectable women did not wander alone in a blizzard. Respectable women, Clara thought bitterly, were protected by the very walls that had just thrown her out. A mile later, her strength began to fail. The cold entered her boots first, then her bones. Her breath came in thin white clouds. The storm erased the moon, the fields, the fence lines, until there was only the faint black ribbon of road beneath her feet and the sound of her own name spoken by no one. She might have missed the carriage entirely if not for the lanterns. They appeared through the snow like two watchful eyes, moving slowly along the road from the north. Clara tried to step aside, but her knees weakened, and she sank into the drift with one hand still clutching Maggie's little book. The horses stopped. A man's voice cut through the wind, low and impatient. Then a door opened. She saw black boots in the snow, the hem of a dark coat, and a face half-shadowed beneath the brim of a hat. Duke Alexander Hayes looked down at her, as if the storm had placed an accusation at his feet. Clara tried to rise. Pride demanded it. Her body refused. "Please," she whispered, though she did not know whether she was asking for help or forgiveness. The Duke's expression hardened at the word, but his eyes lowered to the blue book in her frozen hand. Something old and painful moved behind his silence. For a moment, it seemed he would leave her there because some memory had taught him that mercy was dangerous. Then he bent, lifted the valise first, and gave orders to his driver with the quiet authority of a man used to being obeyed. Clara remembered the warmth of his cloak around her shoulders, the scent of cold wool and smoke, and the last thing she saw before the carriage swallowed her was Harrington House disappearing behind the storm, its golden windows dimming until they looked no warmer than stars. The carriage ride to Hawthorne Hall passed through a world that no longer seemed attached to daylight. Clara Bennett sat opposite Duke Alexander Hayes with his dark cloak wrapped around her shoulders and Maggie's little blue book resting in her lap, like a piece of evidence no court would ever admit. Snow struck the carriage windows in white bursts, then slid away into blackness. The wheels groaned over ruts hidden beneath the drifts. Every few minutes the horses slowed, fighting the road, and each time Clara felt the Duke's gaze shift toward the window as though measuring the storm against some memory he despised. He had asked her name only once. When she gave it, he had repeated it with the grave courtesy of a man placing a fragile object on a high shelf. Miss Bennet. Nothing more. He did not ask why she had been alone. He did not ask who had dismissed her. He did not ask why a governess was wandering Mill Creek Road in weather that even farmers would not face unless a roof was burning. His silence should have comforted her. Instead, it made her aware of every sound she made. The faint chatter of her teeth, the wet hem of her dress brushing the carriage floor, the small, humiliating gasp that escaped when warmth began to return painfully to her fingers. At last, lanterns appeared ahead, not gentle and welcoming, but high and watchful, burning from the stone posts of an iron gate. Hawthorne Hall rose beyond them, enormous and gray, its towers cut into the storm like the shoulders of a sleeping beast. Most of its windows were dark. The few that glowed did so behind heavy glass, pale as candle flames in a mausoleum. Clara had heard the name, of course. Everyone within 30 miles had. The Duke of Hawthorne, they said, had once been one of the most admired men in the state, invited to every grand house from New York to Newport, until one winter night took his wife, closed his heart, and turned his estate into a place where music was never played after sundown. The carriage stopped beneath a covered entrance. Before Clara could reach for the door, the Duke stepped out into the storm and offered his hand. It was not intimate. It was not tender. It was simply there, steady and gloved, a bridge across the deep snow. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. The instant her feet touched the ground, the wind seized her breath. Alexander guided her up the stone steps without tightening his grip, as if even in rescue he feared the appearance of possession. The great doors opened before them. Warmth struck Clara's face, followed by the smell of beeswax, old wood, and smoke. A butler in a black coat stood in the entrance hall, his silver hair neat, his expression trained into discipline, though shock flickered in his eyes when he saw Clara. "Mrs. Whittaker," the Duke said, removing his hat. "Now." The butler bowed and vanished. Clara remained just inside the door, dripping onto a rug so fine she wanted to step off it. The hall was vast, paneled in dark walnut, with a staircase curving upward into shadow. Portraits lined the walls, but many were covered in black cloth. At the far end stood a tall clock, its pendulum still. Its hands, Clara noticed, marked 2:17. No servant seemed willing to look at it. No one seemed willing to breathe too loudly. An older woman soon appeared, fastening the collar of her gray dress as if she had been pulled from sleep. "Your Grace, Miss Bennet was found on Mill Creek Road. She requires warmth, dry clothing, and a room." Mrs. Whittaker's eyes softened at once when she saw Clara's soaked sleeves and pale mouth, but the softness vanished beneath worry. "Your Grace, the east wing roof has taken water. 2 chimneys are blocked, and the south guest rooms are being used for the Bridge families. Mr. Lawson brought in 7 people from the road before the crossing froze." Alexander went still. The blue room, flooded near the hearth. The nursery suite? Mrs. Whittaker's face changed. Only slightly, but Clara saw it. "Locked, Your Grace." The Duke's jaw tightened. "Unlock it. The flue has not been cleaned in years. It would not be safe tonight." The wind slammed against the doors behind Clara as if demanding entry. Somewhere above, a shutter banged once, then again, like an anxious hand. Alexander looked toward the staircase, and for the first time since she had met him, Clara saw not command but reluctance. It passed quickly, buried under the cold discipline that seemed to hold him together. Then the North Tower. Mrs. Whittaker inhaled. "Your Grace, is there firewood?" "Yes." "Is the roof sound?" "Yes, but that room has not been used since." She stopped. The silence finished the sentence for her. Clara looked from the housekeeper to the Duke and understood that a door in this house could be more feared than the storm outside. Alexander turned to Clara. "Miss Bennet, there is no proper arrangement available tonight. I regret that deeply." The words were formal, but his voice had roughened at the edges. "I will not send you back into the weather to protect appearances that others have already used against you." Clara's throat tightened. Pride urged her to refuse. Fear urged her to accept. Exhaustion made the choice for her. She nodded once. As Mrs. Whittaker led the way upstairs with a candle, Clara followed the Duke into the dark spine of Hawthorne Hall, past covered portraits, past locked doors, past the stopped clock below, while the storm climbed the walls like a living thing and the North Tower waited above them with all its buried ghosts. Mrs. Whittaker stopped before a narrow door at the end of the north corridor, where the air seemed colder than the rest of the house, and the candle in her hand bent sideways though no window stood open. Clara Bennet watched the housekeeper remove a key from a ring at her waist, but the older woman did not place it in the lock at once. Her fingers rested there, motionless, as if the door might remember every hand that had abandoned it. Duke Alexander Hayes stood behind Clara, silent and rigid. In the faint candlelight, his face had become almost colorless. The storm pressed against the tower walls with a long, grieving moan. "Mrs. Whittaker," he said quietly. The housekeeper lowered her eyes, turned the key, and opened the door. Warmth did not greet them. Memory did. The chamber beyond was large and shadowed, with dark blue walls, heavy drapes, and furniture draped in white linen that made every shape resemble a waiting ghost. The fireplace had been laid, but not lit. A silver brush still rested on the vanity, dulled by dust. On the mantel, beneath a black veil so fine it stirred with the draught, hung the portrait of a young woman whose face Clara could not clearly see. Yet the room belonged to her. That was obvious in the pressed flowers sealed inside a glass frame, the pale ribbon left on a chair, the faint scent of lavender preserved in fabric long untouched. Clara stepped only as far as the threshold. She felt suddenly like an intruder in a chapel. "I cannot stay here," she whispered before she could stop herself. Alexander's gaze fixed on the veiled portrait, not on her. "No one has stayed here in 5 years." The answer was not meant to comfort, and perhaps that was why it did. Mrs. Whittaker crossed to the hearth with quick, nervous movements and struck a match. The flame caught the kindling, then climbed slowly into the stacked logs. Orange light filled the room by inches, revealing the bed against the far wall, carved from dark wood, its canopy gathered in faded velvet. Clara looked at it once and looked away. The housekeeper noticed. So did the Duke. "I will bring dry clothing," Mrs. Whittaker said, her voice carefully practical. "A plain nightdress, stockings, and broth if cook can spare it. Miss Bennet, you are chilled through." "Thank you," Clara replied, though her voice sounded far away. The housekeeper turned to the Duke. "Your Grace, perhaps Mr. Lawson could remain outside the door." "No," Alexander said, too sharply. Then softer. "No gossip will begin under my roof by posting a guard outside a woman's chamber. The house already has enough ears." Mrs. Whittaker's mouth tightened, but she bowed. When she left, the latch clicked behind her with such smallness that Clara felt the size of the room all at once. She and the Duke were alone. Not by choice, not by intention, yet alone. Alexander moved first, not toward her, but toward the tall windows where snow thrashed against the glass. He drew the curtains tighter, then turned with the expression of a man about to issue a sentence upon himself. "This was my wife's room." Clara's hands tightened around the wet leather handle of her valise. "Then I should be placed anywhere else. There is nowhere else safe. A chair in the kitchen would do. Not with your dress frozen and your hands near numbness. The servants will talk. Servants talk less when paid fairly and treated well." His voice was cold, but not careless. Clara looked at the bed again, then at the door, then at the fire. Every proper instinct in her recoiled from the arrangement. Every exhausted inch of her body begged for warmth. "Your Grace," she said, forcing steadiness into each word, "I have been accused tonight of something I did not do. By morning, if anyone learns I spent the night here, I will be accused of something else I did not do." The Duke's face changed. For the first time, the command left it. What remained was older, darker, almost ashamed. "I know." The simplicity of it struck harder than denial would have. He crossed to the writing desk, opened a drawer, and removed a small silver knife, a brass key, and a service bell. Clara stiffened, but he laid each object on the table nearest her and stepped back. Then he took hold of the heavy velvet drape beside the wardrobe and cut the curtain cord with one clean motion. The sound was soft, almost delicate, yet it seemed to divide the past from the present. He drew the velvet across the room, fastening it between the wardrobe and the bedpost until a dark partition stood between the hearth and the bed. "You will have that side," he said. "The door will be locked from within, and the key will remain with you. If I move closer than the fire without your permission, ring the bell. Mrs. Whittaker will hear it from the lower landing." Clara stared at him. "And where will you sleep?" "I will not." That is unnecessary. So is defending myself to a woman who has every reason not to trust the world tonight. The fire snapped, throwing light across the hard line of his jaw. Something in Clara's chest loosened by a fraction. Not trust. Not yet, but the first fragile permission to breathe. She reached for the key. It was cold, heavy, real. Alexander lowered his eyes as her fingers closed around it, granting her that small dignity as though it mattered more than his own comfort. Beyond the windows, the storm buried the roads deeper. Within the North Tower, Clara Bennett stood in a dead duchess's chamber while the living duke chose the floor beside the fire. And for the first time since Harrington House cast her out, she understood that safety could arrive wearing the face of a man everyone else feared. Mrs. Whitaker returned with dry garments, hot broth, and a stack of folded blankets, but she did not look toward the bed or the veiled portrait above the mantel. She set everything on the small table near Clara's side of the velvet partition, her careful hands betraying what her face would not. "There is ginger in the broth," she said softly. "It will help warm you." Clara thanked her, and the older woman's eyes lingered on her wet sleeves, her pale lips, the torn valise resting like a defeated animal near the wardrobe. For a moment, Clara thought Mrs. Whitaker might say something kind. Instead, the housekeeper curtsied to the Duke, who stood by the hearth with his back turned, and left them again to the storm. The key turned in the lock beneath Clara's hand. The sound should have frightened her. Instead, it steadied her. On her side of the curtain, she changed quickly into the plain cotton nightdress and wrapped herself in a wool robe that smelled faintly of cedar. She kept her own stockings near the fire until steam rose from them in ghostly threads. The Duke never turned. Not once. His silhouette remained fixed beyond the velvet screen, dark against the amber light, one shoulder angled toward the flames as though he were standing guard over a battlefield only he could see. Clara drank the broth in small, careful sips, feeling heat return to her throat, then her chest, then the deepest parts of her hands. Weariness pressed on her like a heavy palm, yet sleep seemed impossible. Every object in the room carried a memory that did not belong to her. The silver brush on the vanity, the pale ribbon on the chair, the portrait breathing beneath its veil. Was she beautiful? Clara asked before she could stop herself. The silence on the other side of the curtain changed shape. "Yes," Alexander said at last. "And kind." Another pause. "Kinder than I deserved." Clara closed both hands around the cup. People rarely say that unless they are punishing themselves. A low sound came from him, almost a laugh, though it held no amusement. "You speak boldly for someone who met me an hour ago. I speak more boldly when I cannot see a man's face. Then perhaps the curtain is serving both of us." The fire cracked. Wind scraped along the tower like fingernails made of ice. Clara looked at the dark partition between them, aware of how strange the night had become. A duke sat a few feet away in his dead wife's room, while she, a dismissed governess with no references and a stolen reputation, drank his broth under his protection. Yet the curtain made a boundary more honorable than any chaperone Lady Harrington had ever pretended to provide. "My wife's name was Evelyn," he said, so quietly Clara almost missed it. She disliked storms. Clara did not answer. She knew when a confession was not asking for comfort, only permission to exist. "There was an accident on the North Road," he continued. "A carriage wheel broke. I had been delayed in town. By the time I reached her, the snow had covered most of the tracks. The clock downstairs stopped that night. Mrs. Whitaker never had it repaired." Clara's fingers tightened around the cup. He gave no terrible details, no cruel picture, only the outline of loss, and somehow the restraint made it heavier. "I am sorry," she said. "So am I." His answer was too immediate, too practiced. Clara set the empty cup aside and drew the blanket closer. "That is not the same thing." On the other side of the curtain, his chair shifted slightly. "What is not?" "Being sorry for losing someone, and being sorry as if you caused the world to break." The room went still. Even the fire seemed to lower its voice. Clara wished she could take the words back, but truth, once spoken gently, could not be returned. "You know a great deal about guilt, Miss Bennet." "I know a great deal about being blamed." A gust of wind struck the window hard enough to make the glass tremble. Clara flinched despite herself. The Duke must have heard it, because his voice came softer when he spoke again. "The family who dismissed you tonight. What did they say you had done?" Clara looked toward her valise. Maggie's blue book rested on top, its edges damp, its cover warped from snow. They said I stole pearls. Did you? No. There was no hesitation in her answer, no ornament, no plea. Just the truth, standing in a room where truth had become unfamiliar. Then I believe you. Clara's breath caught. Not because the words were grand. They were not. They were quiet, almost stern. But no one at Harrington House had asked. No one had waited. No one had believed the word of a governess against the convenience of a lie. You should not, she whispered. You do not know me. I know what a false accusation sounds like when it has been rehearsed by people who expect obedience. Clara closed her eyes. Behind the curtain, the Duke did not move closer. He did not soften the moment with pity. He only added another log to the fire and kept watch while the storm battered the tower. And sometime before dawn, with the brass key beneath her pillow and the bell within reach of her hand, Clara Bennett finally slept. Not because the world had become safe, but because one broken man had chosen, for one long night, to make himself safer than the storm. By dawn, the storm had not ended. It had only changed its voice. The violent shrieking of the night had softened into a thick, steady silence, the kind that comes when snow has buried every road, every roofline, every careless footprint that might have proved the world existed beyond the windows. Clara Bennett woke to gray light pressing through the edges of the curtains and, for a moment, did not know where she was. Then she felt the brass key beneath her palm, heard the low breath of the dying fire, and saw the velvet partition standing between her and the room where a duke had kept watch instead of sleeping. She sat up carefully. Her borrowed robe had slipped from one shoulder, and the wool blanket lay warm across her knees. Her own dress hung near the hearth, no longer dripping, though still wrinkled and stained at the hem with road salt and mud. On the other side of the screen, Duke Alexander Hayes sat in the carved chair beside the fire, his head bowed slightly, one hand resting near an open book he had not turned a page of in hours. He was asleep, or near enough to it that grief had loosened its grip on his face. Without the command in his eyes, he looked less severe, not younger exactly, but more human. Clara watched only for a second before looking away. Even pity could become an intrusion in a room like that. She rose quietly, folded the blanket, and reached for Maggie's blue book on the table. The small volume had dried unevenly, its cover bent, its corners softened by melted snow. When she opened it, something slipped from between the pages and fell soundlessly onto the carpet. Clara froze. It was a folded sheet of cream paper, thin and formal, marked with a seal she knew too well. Harrington. Her hands turned cold all over again. She had not placed it there. She bent to retrieve it just as the Duke stirred. Miss Bennet. His voice was rough from wakefulness denied. Clara held the paper against her chest. I did not mean to wake you. His eyes moved to the letter. What is that? I do not know. But she did know enough to fear it. Alexander rose, keeping his distance as he had all night. Open it. Clara looked at him. Your Grace, if it is another accusation, then it is better read in a room where someone has already chosen not to believe one. The words steadied her more than they should have. She broke the seal. Inside was not a letter, but a copy of a legal page, folded small enough to hide in a child's book. The ink had blurred in places, but the names remained visible. Margaret Harrington, deceased. Magnolia Harrington, minor heir, trust funds, educational provision, guardian restrictions. Clara's breath caught. Maggie, dear little Maggie, who had stood by the nursery door with terror in her eyes, had hidden the proof where only Clara would find it. Beneath the page lay another scrap, written in a child's careful hand. Miss Bennet, they said you must go because you knew. I put Mama's paper in your book. Please do not let them take it. Clara pressed her fingers to her lips, not to weep, but to hold herself together. Alexander read the note over her shoulder only after she offered it. His expression changed with a dangerous quiet. Not anger shown, but anger disciplined until it became purpose. This is why they sent you into the storm. Clara nodded. Lady Harrington said I was ungrateful. She said no one would trust a governess dismissed for theft. She underestimated the child, and overestimated how easily a poor woman disappears. The Duke looked toward the veiled portrait, then to the stopped clock on the mantel. Something in him seemed to make a decision that had been waiting 5 years for a worthy cause. Mrs. Whittaker will bring breakfast. After that, You will remain in this room until I know who inside this house can be trusted. Clara drew back. Remain hidden? That will make it worse. No. It will keep you safe while I send a rider to the county clerk and another to my attorney in Albany. The roads are buried. My stable master knows the old logging trail. It is dangerous, but passable for a short distance if a man knows where the fences run. Clara looked down at the child's note. Maggie is still in that house. The Duke's face hardened, but his voice stayed low. Then by noon, Harrington House will learn that the woman they cast out did not fall into silence. She fell into my protection. Outside the tower, footsteps hurried in the corridor. Not Mrs. Whitaker's careful tread, but several voices rising below, startled and sharp. Alexander turned toward the door. Clara heard her own name carried up through the stairwell, spoken by a man with polished outrage. Harrington. The storm had not kept the past away. It had brought it straight to Hawthorne Hall. The voices below rose and fell like a fire trying to catch in damp wood. Polished outrage, servant whispers, the scrape of boots across marble, and through it all the unmistakable authority of a man who had arrived certain that shame would obey him. Clara Bennett stood in the north tower chamber with Maggie's note folded against her palm, every line of her body gone still. Duke Alexander Hayes looked at the door as if he could see through the oak, through the stairwell, down to the great hall where the morning had turned against them before breakfast could be served. Stay here, he said. Clara lifted her chin. I have spent too much of my life staying where powerful people put me. His eyes returned to her, sharp at first, then changed by something like respect. Then stand where you can be seen, but say nothing until I ask. Why? Because Mr. Harrington has come to hear fear. We shall disappoint him. He opened the door, and the cold corridor received them. Mrs. Whitaker waited just outside with a tray in her hands and worry in her face. When she saw Clara dressed in the plain borrowed robe, the housekeeper's eyes softened, then dropped to the legal paper in Clara's hand. The Duke spoke before any question could form. Send Lawson by the logging trail to Albany. He will carry a sealed note to Mr. Everett. No delay. Mrs. Whitaker nodded once. And the young girl? Clara asked before she could stop herself. The housekeeper's expression tightened. She is below. Clara's heart gave a painful leap. Maggie is here, wrapped in a carriage blanket and frightened half out of her senses, but unharmed. The word unharmed did not erase the image of the child standing before strangers in a hall of judgment, but it gave Clara enough strength to follow. They descended the staircase with the Duke slightly ahead, not as though leading her into danger, but as though placing himself between her and the worst of it. Hawthorne Hall's great entrance chamber had filled with people. Servants lined the shadowed edges. A county constable stood near the doors with snow on his shoulders, looking deeply uncomfortable to have been summoned into a nobleman's house before sunrise. Mr. Harrington stood beside him, red-faced from cold and indignation, his expensive coat dusted with white. Lady Harrington sat in a chair near the hearth, one gloved hand pressed dramatically to her chest. And there, beside Mrs. Whitaker's assistant, stood Maggie Harrington, small and pale, her copper curls crushed beneath a wool hood, both hands gripping the edges of a blanket. The moment she saw Clara, the child's face trembled with relief. Clara almost went to her. Alexander's voice stopped the room first. Mr. Harrington, you appear to have crossed 3 miles of buried road for a dismissed governess. Mr. Harrington's smile was thin. For stolen property, Your Grace. And now, I regret, for scandal. We traced Miss Bennet here after she fled our house last night. She did not flee. She was abandoned on a public road during a blizzard. A ripple moved through the servants. Lady Harrington sat straighter. She was dismissed for theft. An accusation is not proof. The necklace was found in her trunk. Conveniently, the single word struck harder than a shout. Mr. Harrington's mouth tightened. Your Grace, I hesitate to speak plainly in your home, but the woman spent the night under your roof. In your private tower, by all accounts. Whatever pity you feel, her character is no longer a question that concerns respectable people. Clara felt the room turn toward her. Heat climbed her throat, but she did not lower her eyes. The Duke did not look at her either, and somehow that steadied her more. He was not measuring her shame. He was measuring theirs. Respectability, Alexander said, has often been a costume worn by those who fear being examined too closely. Lady Harrington's fan snapped open. How dare you? Very easily. The words were quiet. Several servants looked down to hide their faces. The constable cleared his throat. Your Grace, perhaps if the matter of the pearls could be settled first. It will be. Alexander turned at last to Clara. Miss Bennet, did you remove Lady Harrington's necklace? No, Your Grace. Did you hide any document belonging to the Harrington estate? Mr. Harrington's head jerked. Clara saw it. So did the Duke. No, she said. But one was hidden for me. Maggie made a small sound, hardly more than a breath. Lady Harrington reached for the child's hand, but Maggie stepped back. The movement was tiny. It changed the room. Alexander held out his hand, and Clara placed the folded legal page and the child's note into it. He did not read them aloud at once. He let the Harringtons watch the seal, the handwriting, the names they had hoped would remain buried. Then he looked to the constable. This concerns a minor's trust, a missing will, and a false charge used to remove the only woman who questioned both. You will remain here until my attorney arrives. Mr. Harrington gave a stiff laugh. No attorney will cross this storm for a governess. From somewhere near the open doors came the sound of a horse snorting in the cold and a man calling for fresh blankets. Mrs. Whittaker stepped forward, calm as a church bell. Mr. Lawson has already gone. For the first time, Mr. Harrington's certainty faltered. Clara saw it pass across his face, a crack no wider than a thread, but enough. Alexander moved down the final step until he stood level with the man who had tried to erase her. You mistook silence for weakness, he said. That was your first error. His eyes shifted to Maggie, softening only slightly. Your second was frightening a child who knew where the truth was hidden. Maggie looked at Clara then, and Clara could no longer remain still. She crossed the hall and knelt before the girl, keeping her hands open, waiting. Maggie stepped into her arms without a word. The room did not become warmer. The storm did not cease. But beneath the stopped clock and the covered portraits, something long buried inside Hawthorne Hall stirred awake, not loudly, not sweetly, but with the first grave breath of justice. The arrival of Mr. Everett did not sound like rescue. It sounded like wheels grinding through packed snow, a horse stamping hard against the frozen drive, and the great doors of Hawthorne Hall opening to admit a man with ice on his coat and law in his leather case. By then, the household had been suspended in a silence so complete that even the servants moved as if the floor might remember their footsteps. Clara Bennet sat near the hearth with Maggie pressed close at her side, the child's small hand tucked into hers beneath the blanket. Across the hall, Mr. and Lady Harrington had ceased performing outrage and begun performing patience, which frightened Clara more. Outrage burned quickly. Patience calculated. Duke Alexander Hayes stood beneath the stopped clock, his face unreadable, his dark coat still marked with ash from the fire he had tended through the night. When Mr. Everett entered, the Duke did not greet him warmly. Men who trusted each other did not always require warmth. You came faster than I expected, Alexander said. Lawson rode like a man carrying the last page of the Bible, Mr. Everett replied, removing his gloves. He was gray-haired, narrow-eyed, and so dry in manner that even the storm seemed reluctant to interrupt him. His gaze moved to Clara, then to Maggie, then to the Harringtons. I understand there is a child's trust, a missing testament, and an accusation convenient enough to insult the intelligence of every person in this room. Lady Harrington rose. Sir, I will not be spoken of as though I am on trial. Mr. Everett opened his case. Madam, the law has a way of deciding that without asking your preference. The constable coughed into his fist. Mr. Harrington stepped forward with the polished smile of a man accustomed to buying time. A misunderstanding has clearly occurred. Miss Bennet was emotional last evening. Children become attached to servants. Documents are easily misplaced. As for the necklace, my wife's maid can confirm it was discovered among Miss Bennet's belongings. Excellent, Mr. Everett said. Then we will speak with the maid. The smile faded by half an inch. She remained at Harrington House. How unfortunate. I sent Lawson there after he reached the road office. He will bring any necessary witnesses back with him if the weather permits. If it does not, signed statements will do for the moment. Lady Harrington's fan trembled once, then stilled. Clara felt Maggie's fingers tighten. Alexander saw the movement and looked, not at the child, but at the woman who had frightened her. His voice lowered. Miss Bennet will answer no more questions as an accused party. She stands under my protection until this matter is settled. Mr. Harrington laughed softly. Protection is a generous word for what society will call last night. The hall changed. Not loudly, not visibly, but every servant seemed to stop breathing at once. Clara felt the old shame rise, familiar and cold, the shame others handed to poor women because it cost them nothing. She began to stand, but Maggie clung to her hand. Alexander moved first. He descended the final step beneath the clock and faced Mr. Harrington with a stillness more severe than anger. You will not use my roof to stain the name of a woman I sheltered from a storm you created. Your roof, Mr. Harrington said. Your Grace, she was in your private chamber. Behind a locked partition, with the key in her hand, a bell within reach, my housekeeper aware of the arrangement, and myself seated beside the fire until morning. His voice carried to every corner of the hall. There was no secrecy. There was only a lack of rooms, a dangerous storm, and a choice between propriety and human life. I chose life. Clara looked up at him then, not because he had defended her, but because he had done so without making her sound helpless. He had not called her innocent as though she were a child. He had called her protected as though she were a person whose dignity remained intact. Mr. Everett lifted Maggie's note with careful fingers. Miss Harrington, he said gently, did you place your mother's paper inside Miss Bennet's book? Maggie's face turned pale. Clara knelt beside her. You do not have to be brave all at once, she whispered. Only true. The child swallowed, then nodded. Mama said the money was for school, Maggie said, her voice small but clear. Miss Clara asked where it had gone. After that, Aunt Viola said Miss Clara was wicked. Lady Harrington's face whitened. The child is confused. No, Maggie said, and the word, though tiny, broke something open. I heard you tell Uncle Edwin that no one listens to governesses. The silence that followed was deeper than the snow outside. Mr. Everett folded the legal page and placed it into his case. Constable, I believe the matter has shifted considerably. The constable straightened. Yes, sir. It appears so. Lady Harrington sank back into her chair, no longer pale with drama, but with fear of consequence. Mr. Harrington looked toward the doors as if calculating the distance to his carriage. Alexander stepped aside, not blocking him, only making it clear that escape would now have witnesses. Clara rose slowly, Maggie still beside her. The firelight touched the veiled portraits, the dark staircase, the stopped clock, and the faces of servants who had watched a woman enter in disgrace and stand through the morning unbroken. For years, Hawthorne Hall had preserved sorrow like a sacred relic. But on that snowbound morning, sorrow made room for justice, and justice, though quiet, proved loud enough to shake even the respectable lies of the powerful. By afternoon, the snow began to loosen its hold on Hawthorne Hall. It did not vanish. It softened. Sunlight, pale and uncertain, touched the upper windows and turned the drifts along the drive into fields of white glass. The Harrington carriage left under the constable's watch, carrying less pride than it had brought, while Mr. Everett remained in the library with ledgers, statements, and Maggie's mother's paper spread across the Duke's long oak table. Lady Harrington's pearls were found exactly where truth often waits, not in the trunk of a poor governess, but in the locked drawer of the maid who had been ordered to place them there. The confession, when it came, was not loud. Most shameful things become smaller when spoken in daylight. Clara Bennet heard the news from Mrs. Whittaker, who delivered it with tea, a folded dress, and eyes bright with the satisfaction of a woman who had served justice without raising her voice. Maggie sat beside Clara near the schoolroom window, drawing careful houses with smoke curling from their chimneys, each one with a door open. When Clara praised the picture, the child leaned against her arm with the trust of someone learning that grown people could still mean safety. It should have comforted Clara. Instead, it made leaving harder. By 4 o'clock, the road to town was passable enough for a sleigh. Clara packed the few belongings she owned into her worn valise: the mended gloves, the comb, Maggie's blue book, and the torn remains of the reference letter that no longer mattered. Her name had been cleared, but a cleared name did not always find employment. A woman could be proven innocent and still be remembered for having needed proof. She found Duke Alexander Hayes in the great hall beneath the stopped clock. He stood with one hand on the banister, looking not at her, but at the clock face that had held 2:17 for 5 years. The black cloth had been removed from one portrait nearby. Evelyn's painted face looked down from the wall, gentle and young, no longer hidden, no longer treated as a wound that could not bear light. "You are leaving?" Alexander said. It was not a question. "I should." Clara held her valise with both hands. "Your house has already done more for me than I had any right to ask. Houses do nothing. People decide what happens inside them." She looked at him then, and the quiet between them was different from the night before. Less fearful, more dangerous in the tenderest way, because it asked for honesty. "Then you decided generously, Your Grace." His mouth tightened slightly, as if praise was a language he had forgotten. "No, I decided late." He looked toward the schoolroom door, where Maggie's laughter, small but real, slipped into the hall as Mrs. Whittaker showed her how to fold paper birds. The sound moved through Hawthorne Hall like the first note of music after years of mourning. Alexander listened to it with an expression Clara could not name. "Mr. Everett believes I can petition for temporary guardianship while her mother's trust is restored," he said. "Harrington House will not have her again." Clara's heart lifted, then ached. "That is good. It is necessary." He turned fully toward her at last. "It is also insufficient." Clara's fingers tightened on the valise handle. "What do you mean?" "A child cannot be raised by lawyers, ledgers, and a man who has spent 5 years confusing silence with strength." The admission cost him. She saw it in the way his hand closed once over the banister, then released. "Maggie trusts you. Mrs. Whittaker respects you. And he stopped. The fire in the hall whispered behind them. "I find that this house is less unbearable when you are in it." Clara's breath caught, not because the words were romantic, but because they were restrained so carefully that every one of them seemed chosen from the ruins of his pride. "Your Grace, Alexander," he said quietly, then lowered his eyes as if he had asked too much. "Only if you wish." She looked down at her valise, at the worn leather and the repaired strap, at everything she owned small enough to carry away. Then she looked at the open schoolroom door, the uncovered portrait, the clock waiting to be touched by time again. "What are you offering me?" "A position first. Governess to Maggie, with wages, references, and complete authority over her education. A room of your own in the West Wing, with a lock to which only you hold the key." Clara felt the fragile dignity of that promise before she felt anything else. And after that, Alexander's gaze met hers. The coldness was still there, but no longer empty. It had become a boundary, not a prison. After that, only what time earns honestly. Nothing demanded, nothing presumed. The house seemed to hold its breath. Clara slowly set her valise down. In the schoolroom, Maggie laughed again, clearer this time, and Mrs. Whittaker made a sound suspiciously close to weeping. Alexander looked toward the stopped clock, then reached up and opened the glass. His fingers touched the frozen hands with a reverence that belonged to farewell rather than forgetting. The minute hand moved. Once, then again. The pendulum below gave a hesitant swing, as if the heart of Hawthorne Hall had forgotten its own rhythm and was learning it back by degrees. Clara stood beside him as the first measured tick filled the hall. Not loud, not triumphant, only steady. Outside, the storm had left the world buried, but clean. Inside, a girl had been believed, a child had been saved, and a broken man had opened a door without asking anyone to walk through it before she was ready. Some storms do not ruin a woman's name. They reveal the man willing to protect it. And sometimes, in the quiet after the snow, 2 wounded hearts discover that shelter is not a place, but the hand that gives you back your choice.